Good morning, or I should say, good afternoon.
Recording in progress.
Should light off.
Light off is okay. Very good. So just before, because some of you were not here last time, I will just start a little bit of review very briefly. I will try to be much quicker than last time, but because you were not here. So I was talking last time about Thomistic ethics. The first session was on metaphysics. You were here for that one. Thomistic ethics. So when we talk about Thomistic ethics, not working. I think I go. When we talk about Aquinas's ethics, I was talking about Aquinas's ethics as a sort of combination of different views. And I brought up three different aspects of his overall ethics connected to the metaphysics. So we talked last time about the metaphysics. The metaphysics of Aquinas is about act and potency, act and potential. And we talked in the end, one of the implications of his metaphysics was that we have a convertibility between being and goodness. Things that are good are existing perfectly, more better, right? In terms of their being fulfilled as what they are. So Aquinas's notion of happiness is basically the same thing. To exist as a human being is to be a member of a natural kind of thing, human being, species, Homo sapiens. And to be a good human being is to fulfill your natural function, to be a good instance of that natural kind of thing. So I put on a different slide here, because being and goodness are convertible, perfection lies in existing more. So to be a good person is to be a person in the full meaning of the word. So to be a good human being is to be a human being that is a good example of all the functions of human beings, right? So like a healthy human being is a good human being in this sense. Whereas a sick human being is doing badly because they are not functioning well as human beings, a sick person. Evil, moral evil, is by analogy very similar to sickness. So sickness is like a lack of function in my body. For Aquinas, moral evil or vice, bad habits, is very similar to sickness. It is a lack of proper functioning. Where? In your mind, in your decisions, based on your reasoning. That's what it is to be morally evil, is to lack proper function. And to be a good person is to function well in your mind and in your reasoning about what you should do with your life. So being morally good is to be perfect as the kind of thing you are. Human beings are reasoning animals. So to be a good human being is to reason well about what I should do. And reasoning well is not just something that happens in your mind, because you have to know, just like with sickness and health, if you just take any medicine at all, it doesn't necessarily help you. You have to know how to pick the right medicine, the medicine that will really help you, the food that will really make you healthy. In the same way, to be a good person, you have to pursue, by reasoning, the things that will really make you happy, that will really be good for you. So both things are important, how we make decisions and what we seek. what good we seek in life. So this is what I meant by, when we look here, how we are seeking the good is equally important to what we are seeking. So some things can make us really happy and some things cannot. And so I listed different things and reasons Aquinas thinks many things could not make us really happy. If I pursued food as the end of my life is only about good food, like I like really good cooking and baking, that would not make me perfectly happy because my faculties, my mind and things are not fulfilled just by food. I would live a very depressing life without other people in my life, without doing anything for fun apart from cooking, without learning anything. If all I knew was cooking, I would know nothing else. My life would be very boring, would be very depressing, right? Most people, if they did these sorts of things, pursued one of these goals completely, it would be a very bad life. And you'd find them to have real problems. So I'll just give you a simple example. If you take a baby, medical truth here, okay? I'm not a medical doctor, but you can go look it up. It's a real problem. If you take a baby after it's born and you do not talk to it, if you do not hold it, you just take the baby right after it's born, put it in a pram, in a crib in the hospital, and walk away. Or you get a machine to feed it, right? You get the machine to feed it and change its diaper. It will die. It will almost certainly die, or it will have very serious mental problems. It's a real medical phenomenon. This is why in hospitals, they found this happens in early days of hospitals. And so to prevent this from happening, sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS in English, nurses have to go around and pick up the babies when they're in the hospital. Otherwise, they will die. That's, I think, actually rather similar to what Aquinas means here. There are certain facts about what is and is not good for us. And pursuing some things will actually deform us. It is connected even to our biology, that certain things are bad for us. So another example, silly example. If I decided I wanted to eat glass, I take the window, break it apart, and I decide I want to eat it. I can't do it. It's physically impossible. So even if I might have good reasons for trying to eat glass, maybe I don't know, I thought it was made of sugar or something, but it's going to matter whether the glass and I actually fit, right? Whether I can actually digest it. Because I can't, it will hurt me, right? So Aquinas thinks the only thing that could really fulfill us, he thinks, as I explained last time, is God. He thinks this is true both naturally and supernaturally. So what does that mean? I meant that he thinks even if we knew nothing about Christianity, from philosophy alone, we could understand the highest goal of human life, the thing we should be living for, is to know and love God as the first cause of the universe. Because he thinks the highest aim we have as human beings is to seek the good in general, being in general. We can know those things with our minds. We do science. Why do we do science? To know why things exist at all. So he thinks the highest aim of human life is to be a good human being, pursuing those highest things, like God, in a community with other people. So he thinks I should love other people. I should be willing to sacrifice myself for other people. I've got to control myself, right? And by pursuing those things, like a life of wisdom, I would be the perfect kind of life, the good kind of life. But he thinks this is just for normal people too. This is like what all the philosophers thought the good life was, living a life of beauty and nobility together with other people in a good country, something like that. But I said the thing that is innovative or distinctive about Aquinas is he thinks that that goal doesn't work by itself. That goal is actually, in many ways, the goal we would be going toward is impossible for us in this life. What do I mean by impossible? He thinks it's good to seek those things, but he thinks that in this life, it would be impossible to be perfectly happy that way. Here's the most serious reason why, and I think it's obvious. That kind of country doesn't exist. It cannot exist in this life. Nobody is going to build a perfect human society like that. But having a perfect society would be a condition of being happy that way, pursuing the truth together with other people in a virtuous community. Aquinas thinks after original sin, that would not be possible. He also thinks even if we could do it, which he does not think we can in this life, he thinks even if we could, there would be a problem with that community. That community would be impermanent. It doesn't exist necessarily. It's the sort of thing where that kind of happiness could end really quickly. We die, we get sick, an asteroid hits my head, I walk out the window and somebody drops a pot, like in a cartoon, and it hits my head, and I lose consciousness and I get retarded for the rest of my life. Then I can't be happy on that way of thinking about happiness, the classic philosophy way of thinking about happiness, like Aristotle, like Cicero, like the Confucians I will talk about today. That kind of happiness is only available with good luck. You have to live at the right time and place in a good country. People that are born in bad countries, Aristotle says they're just screwed. They can't live a happy life. They're just screwed. Your government, like in North Korea, persecuting everybody, public executions, starving everybody. You have no education, no access to good sanitation. You are just screwed. Aristotle says that's just bad luck, but you can't live a good life in those circumstances. Not really possible. So Aquinas thinks that's true. That kind of happiness is very limited, very contingent, very lucky. And so even if you had it, it would not be perfect. It would not be perfect. And so the majority of his thinking is of a different possibility. He thinks it's related to that natural possibility, but he thinks there's a more perfect kind of happiness that is made possible by God. This is where I talked about grace. Grace is the central idea of Aquinas's notion of happiness. What is grace? Grace is sharing in God's own life. Sharing in God's own life. So Aquinas thinks only God could do that. We can't share in God's own life by myself because I'm not God. So I don't have his life by nature, right? The window is not God. It can't give me that life. You're not God. You can't give me divine life. Only God can. So this is where Christianity comes in. And Aquinas thinks Christianity is precisely that. It is the mechanism, it is the truth that God wants to give us his own life. All of Christianity is about that, and all of Christian practice is about maintaining God's own life. That's it. And it has to come from God. So it's nothing I can do to get it. Aquinas thinks we cooperate somehow with what God has done, but that's the idea. God is making it possible. It is grace, right? So this is then the idea of why Aquinas thinks the true life, true good life, is going to be about love and is going to be about a sort of special activity we live as Christians in union with God through these things called gifts of the Holy Spirit. For Christians, for people who have faith in God, they are able to have a direct kind of relationship with God. God is actually guiding them. And why Aquinas thinks this is because it enables everybody, no matter how stupid they are, no matter how bad luck they have in their life, everybody can be perfectly happy, not just in the future when they attain the goal of the Christian life. For Aquinas, the goal of the Christian life is to have complete happiness in a way you cannot lose it. Aquinas thinks that happens in heaven. And what happens in heaven? You understand God's own mind as God himself understands his mind. That's what we call the beatific vision. But even in this life, Aquinas thinks, even now, he thinks people who are Christians in good standing, people that love God, he thinks the Holy Spirit, God himself, is in the Christian. And no matter how stupid you are, no matter how unlucky you are, you can be perfectly happy right now. That's his thought. And how is that possible? Well, he thinks even if you're stupid, even if you're unlucky, God is in control of everything, and God is in you. So you can be guided by God to know what you need to do, even when you're very unlucky. So the best example that I gave last time was the martyrs. So this is very distinctively Christian, but Aquinas thinks the martyrs are happy because they, even though the bad stuff is happening to them and their families, they are getting tortured and killed, they can be completely at peace because they know God is going to use everything for their good and the good of other people. And they can be perfectly loving and perfectly peaceful and even joyful in the midst of torture. And Aquinas thinks this doesn't require saying that my family doesn't matter, my life doesn't matter. Many classical philosophers had a view like that, where they said, the truly happy person doesn't care about anything. Buddhists say something a little like that, right? Buddhists say you should be detached from love of anything, right? Christians, Aquinas, think you can love your family, the world, the good stuff, but the reason you can be perfectly happy when you are being tortured and they are killing your family in front of you is not because your family doesn't matter. It's because God is in charge of your family and you. And God will ensure that once you know through faith that this is true happiness and that God is in charge, then you can know in that moment when the bad things are happening to you that the bad people can do nothing to hurt you. The bad people cannot really hurt you at all. They can hurt your body, but God will bring your body back. The bad people can torture your family, but as long as your family is trusting God too, they can't do anything to them either. The most they can do is destroy their bodies, but God will bring their bodies back too. You'll be together with them again. The only thing the bad people can do is hurt themselves. So that's how the Christians would understand this scenario. And Aquinas thinks this is the unique thing about Christian happiness. No matter how stupid you are, no matter how bad the world is, even when people are directly killing and torturing you and your family, you can be happy and love all these people and love the world and be happy about the world that God has created. It doesn't require you to be distant, detached. Okay? So that's my little review of last time. This time, I want to give you a slightly different perspective. I heard many people here have not studied Chinese philosophy. Let me make sure I have the right slide up here. Okay, very good. So I want to talk a little bit about Chinese philosophy because I like Chinese philosophy. And I think it helps, even if you're not into Chinese philosophy, I know many people maybe at this university are not Confucians. In Hong Kong, in mainland China, we have lots of people that like Chinese philosophy and Confucianism. So I have to do a little bit of justification here. Why should we care? Well, I'll give you a reason to care, even if you think Chinese philosophy, it's not part of my life, right? Why should I care about this? Well, here's, I think, a helpful way to think about it. Imagine now what I'm going to argue is true. Here's what I'm going to argue. I'm going to argue that the Confucians, specifically some branches of Confucianism, they're sometimes called Neo-Confucians. Specifically, they're called the Chengju Li Shui group, the Chengju School of Li. Okay? I think this school has a very similar metaphysics of the universe and an ethics that looks very similar to Thomas Aquinas. Okay? I don't think it's exactly the same, but I think it is on important points agreed. In fact, here's something I think is even more impressive. I think it is closer to Aquinas than Aristotle. Even though Aquinas had lots to do with Aristotle, he had read a lot of Aristotle. I think this view is closer to most of the important points of Aquinas' overall picture of the universe. I think this view is pretty close to him. Now, here's what's interesting. They had no contact with Aristotle, with Aquinas, with Christianity to any serious degree. Christianity came to China maybe in the 600-700s from the Nestorian Christians. They're called Jingzhao, right? In the old days, in the Tang Dynasty, the Christians came to China. But they probably didn't make much of a serious impact on any of this. The Christians who came during the Mongol Yuan Empire dynasty also made very little impact. But these people seem to have independently come to very similar conclusions as those of Thomas Aquinas. I think that's really important if it was true. Why? Because it gives us a basis for saying something like this, or thinking something like this. I'd call it an inductive case. In epistemology, we sometimes would think the more people agree on certain basic things, maybe the probability of them being true goes up. In this case, I think something like that is going on. If I find people in Europe come to certain mathematical truths, people in the Middle East, Arab world, come to those same truths. They come up with the same math formulas to describe circles or lines, right? And people in China did the same thing, independent of each other. They confirmed the same mathematical proofs. I think they probably were talking about the same truths. The truths are there to be discovered by anybody. So I think by analogy, in philosophy, these claims that the Neo-Confucians might have discovered the same things show us that Aquinas might be right, that all of these things really are the truth about the world. If people across the world, having no contact with Aquinas, could come up with very similar views, just using their brains and observing the world. So let me start a little bit on what the Neo-Confucians thought. I can't be too detailed about it here for us. I was presuming a little bit more familiarity among the students here. So I didn't write out terribly much. I'm starting a little, we say in Latin, in media res, in the middle of things, okay? Which is, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this Chengju school. The Cheng brothers, Cheng Yi and Cheng Hao, and Zhu Xi were, let's say, 10th and 13th century, 10th and 11th century philosophers in China. Okay, the Cheng brothers lived together, and then Zhu Xi was about a generation after them. In around the 1100s is when he was active in China. Song Dynasty, first Song Dynasty. And Zhu Xi is a really important Confucian. If you know, in Japan, Zhu Xi came to Japan, his philosophy, his school. It was not very influential here, from what I understand. It was not as seriously influential as in China and as in Korea. In Korea, this Cheongju school was orthodoxy from the government for up until 1700 almost. So it was very influential in Korea. In China, it was required during civil service exams that you had to give Zhu Xi's explanation of Confucian philosophy. So he was very important during the whole lifetime of the civil service exam in China. So he's an important Confucian. He's a very important Confucian. In his system, he gets his metaphysics from these Chung brothers in particular, but from a whole bunch of other history of Confucians. I'm not going to go into the history with you because it doesn't matter. I will just tell you very basically what he says. What is his view of the world? Well, the basic thing is he has a view that I'm going to say is really similar to Aquinas. He has a composite view of the world. What do we mean by composite? Metaphysically composite. Things and events are composed of two principles. I use this word principle. Principle is not like a math principle. I mean an explanatory causal principle of some kind. Explanatory principle, like heat or energy, is an explanatory principle of things. The things that are doing the explanation, he calls li and qi. So I don't know what they're called in Japanese, okay? Well, I'm not going to write it now. I think I even have it up here, okay? Li, there we go, li and qi, right? Okay. So li, I don't have on this slide too many direct quotes from Zhu Xi. I have a few later, but I will just summarize things, okay? Some of these are pretty close to what he actually says. So, for instance, this definition, li is the reason anything is as it is, the standard to which something should conform. These are both different things he actually says in the classified conversations of Master Zhu, which is the Yulei, the Jutsu Yulei. It's a collection of sayings from him with questions to from his students. He answered questions, and we have this definition. So li is something like a reason something is as it is. You can see the structure of the character here. It originally comes from a word meaning many people think the veins in a leaf or the fractures in jade. You know, there's sort of a structure in jade. So in English, a fairly good translation of the original meaning would be something like structure. But in his philosophy, I think a very close translation of the philosophical meaning is what I just gave, which is principle in the classical sense. Principle. It's the principle of something, right? A principle of something. It explains why it is the way it is. It explains, for instance, why it should behave a certain way. So he says it explains the kinds of functions, the yang, things it can do. And then qi, this character, qi, refers to the stuff of which something is made. So it's pretty clear to me. We could translate it in English as ether, if you really wanted to, because it means something like steam, but it meant something like steam originally. And then this character comes to be like a philosophical concept that, like in the classic Greeks, they thought everything was made of one kind of stuff that like evaporates and condenses. That's kind of the way this character started, this qi concept started from people like Zhan Zai, this earlier Confucian commentator. But it ends up being in Zhu Xi a concept of something like matter. It's the stuff that occupies space and time. It occupies 3 dimensions. It's in a place. So Zhu Xi, for instance, says li would not be anywhere if there was no qi. It would not be in this chair, in that place. If there was no qi, there wouldn't be a chair. The li wouldn't be there. But because there is matter, is qi there, then the li can be right there in the chair, right? Because there's qi in the chair. So these are supposed to be a sort of composite picture of reality. So no material object or affair or event exists which is not a composite of li and qi. So you don't have objects in the world that are just qi without any li. That's impossible for Zhu Xi. But qi by itself, I think, is going to be, I think there are things Zhu Xi says that indicate qi by itself has no properties. It just seems to have no nature by itself. Because he says this li is the same thing as this character, xing. So li and nature mean the same thing. So the li of something is also the nature of that thing. And so if you have qi, let's say, with no li, it would have no nature. The qi would have no nature. So it looks to me impossible for there to be qi by itself. And he says that. He says you can't have it. I would say the cosmology is what I would call emanationist, which is classical Neoplatonic philosophy came up with this idea of emanations. There's like some first thing, the one, and somehow it emanates a sort of scale of different things. Like the image is something like water in like a pool, and it overflows down into different levels. And the whole universe is like from a spring of pure being stuff, and it sort of overflows and makes all sorts of different kinds of things. In fact, there is a diagram. I don't have it here. Okay. There's a diagram. This is Proclus. Okay. I think, oh, no, I'm sorry. This is a medieval picture of the universe. And if you look at Proclus and some of these Neoplatonists, I don't think I have their diagram up here. I have in my class, I put up the diagram of Zhu Xi that he gets from Zhang Zai. He has this thing called the Taiji Tu, which is a picture of the dependence of the universe on a principle he calls Taiji or Wuji, the supreme ultimate. It's sometimes translated in English. And I put it next to Proclus, a diagram of Proclus. And they physically look very similar. They are both like, I'll just draw it. So Zhu Xi's picture is like this. You have this thing up here, which I'm just going to write it in English because it's a little quicker for me. You have this thing, Wuji, and then you have Taiji, which is this second sort of principle. So Taiji is this character, right? Right? Taiji, supreme ultimate. And then this one splits into yin and yang, right? And then gives birth eventually to, there are like the five elements, the wuxing, the sort of 5 stages or 5 elements. And then down here, it's the 10,000 things, right? Which is everything else, basically. So I'm going to just leave it at that for the moment. And just say this picture is what I'm calling roughly emanationist. It starts from up here, and it's some sort of something happens. The one gives birth to 2, yin and yang, gives birth to these 5 stages, gives birth to the 10,000 things. So it's roughly what I would call emanationist. Now, I think in Zhu Xi's philosophy, it is not clear what li. So he says this thing, Wuji and Taiji, these are the same. These are the same. This is just considering it in itself before it gives birth to anything. This is considering it as the principle of everything. But he says it is also equivalent to these things. These all refer to the same thing, right? So Li, Taiji, Tian, all are the same thing. They are all referring to the same thing in the classics of Confucianism. Tian, heaven, Li, principle, Tai Chi or Wu Ji, this is the ultimate thing that explains everything. Okay? So I think I have a book that I wrote. I'll just scoot ahead. Oh, I thought I have it. Here's the book. I wrote a book on his philosophy where I offer some of these interpretations. So if you want to go look it up, you can. Okay? If you don't believe me, if you don't think I'm representing it correctly, I am not going through the texts here, but I do give an interpretation of Zhu Xi on this, where I point out many people are worried about what Zhu Xi says, comparing it to like Aquinas, because you might think, based on what I said the first session, Li sounds a lot like form, doesn't it? Qi sounds a lot like matter, doesn't it? If you know anything about Aquinas, that's what you might think when you hear these terms the first time, because it sounds like they are metaphysical principles of composite, material objects. Well, guess what? That's a lot like what I was saying about form and matter. And I'm sort of explaining them, you might think. Maybe I'm misinterpreting them, like a Western Thomist reading these terms. But many people would point out, Zhu Xi says, there is only one Li in everything. And some people have argued Zhu Xi cannot then mean form, because for Aquinas, you have a form, a substantial form, I have a form, you have a form, you have a form, and they are not the same form, right? My soul is not your soul. But Zhu Xi says there's one Li in everything. So it looks like this isn't doing the same thing. It isn't doing the same thing. I think this is wrong. I think this is a failure to be very specific. So actually, here's what I would say. I'm going to now give you my interpretation. As I said, I cannot defend this, but I think it is well supported by the texts and by other people in the scholarship. Here's what I think is going on. Li in Chinese, this word, in Chinese, there's no definite article. There's no Li, a Li. It doesn't exist. So I think what Zhu Xi was doing is he's using the word Li in a way that I would use the word form with a capital F. And he was trying to make a point, because sometimes he does disambiguate. He says there's a Li of me, and a Li of you, and a Li of a boat, and a Li of different other kinds of things, of dogs, of cats. So he thinks there are different Li, and people are not sure how those Li seem to relate to the one Li. How do they match up? If there's one Li, and you have a Li, and I have a Li, and a boat has a different Li, how can they all be one? Well, I think what's going on is he's using the word Li in a certain way that is like how I would use the word form in general. So we could use the word form in general. There is one form. There is form in everything, I might say in English. There is form in everything. And in particular, here's what I think he's trying to get at. He has this emanationist picture, right? Well, I think what he's trying to say is everything that exists has Li, but the Li that they have is a participation in the one Li. All of the Li of me and of you are somehow related to the one Li. There's one big Li, we might say, that everything is related to somehow. He says it is like one moon. He gets a Buddhist metaphor. There is one moon that is reflecting in 10,000 rivers. And depending on the quality of the river, on the stuff, the qi, the reflection can be very bright, dim, right? Not very good. And he says the quality of the qi that reflects the one Li, that's why they're different kind of things. So he says like rocks reflect the one Li less than human beings. Human beings reflect the one Li much more. Our qi is much clearer. So the one Li manifests in us differently than it does in rocks. That's his explanation. But notice then that there's one Li, and he does disambiguate it at times. He calls it Tian Li. Tian Li, the heavenly Li, the one big one. I think that's what he's referring to when he uses that word. The other word he'd use is Tai Chi, the supreme Li, the big one. And then when he refers to the ones that's in us, he uses this word. He says the quality of this qi, the xing, the nature of this particular quality of qi. So he thinks that each thing does have its own li, in some sense, its own nature. The nature of the dog, the nature of cat, the nature of human being are not the same. Why? Because they have different qualities of qi. They have different qi jizhisheng, this nature instantiated in their matter. So in my view, Zhu Xi does have a view like Aquinas. Each thing has a substantial form that corresponds to this. It doesn't correspond to the one Li. It corresponds to the particular nature of each object. That would be the equivalent of substantial form in Zhu Xi. And so there is such a thing as Tai Chi, right? There is Tian Li, but those aren't the same as the one in me. Why then does he say there's one Li in everything? Well, because all of them are resemblances. They are all participations of the one Li. That's why he wants to say there's one Li in everything. Because he thinks me, my Li, is somehow a result of a partial reception of the one big. So my soul is somehow in the image of, it's a participation of the big thing. In Chinese, he actually uses the word participate, 冰手. It's somehow a reception of the one thing. He uses an image of a seal that is pressed into wax. And he says there's one seal in different things, and it takes different shapes depending on the wax, how hard or soft the wax is. The image will be differently distinct. Now, here's the implication for ethics then. Just like Aquinas, I think Zhu Xi has a view on which Li, by itself, in itself, is good, intrinsically. It's the principle of the goodness of things, what makes them good. He thinks Li is actually has in it all the virtues. So he thinks to be a good person, a morally good person, is to somehow clarify your qi to let the Li shine through. And you already have all the virtues in you, Ren and Qi, Xing, Xin, all the Confucian virtues you have in you because you have Li. So you just need to sort of let it shine, right? He says, he uses another Buddhist image. It's like a pearl in mud. You've got to kind of just wash the mud off to be a good person. But the idea is very clear then. Li is good. Qi is good. Qi is not bad. But qi can somehow obstruct the manifestation of Li in you. Qi can somehow obstruct the manifestation of Li. But in you, in your mind, there's already all virtue, the beginning of all virtue somehow. It's all there. By reverent attention and investigation of Li in everything, by study, by moral cultivation, we can allow our Li to manifest. So the idea then is, by using our mind and by attention, humans can reflect more fully this thing. Tian Li, Tai Chi, can somehow manifest in everything, in you. That's a good person, is somebody who sort of returns to the source, right? To the big source. Okay? It's already there. And I think I put it here already there in potential. Some people dispute this, but I think that's the right way to put it, because I think it's potentially manifest what it means to have the virtues fully in yourself, even though they're not manifest. Sounds to me like the virtues are present potentially in your chi, right? I think we just have to be careful about that. But he thinks, in fact, many animals have all the virtues like we do, or they have some resemblance of the virtues because they're all part of the Tianli, right? So Tianli is really good in this moral sense. It has all the virtues in it. So that's why even animals can exemplify sort of behavior of the virtues. He says, like bees, right, have sort of sociality, ren, because they associate with each other. And like dogs are in packs and they love their babies because they have ren somehow. So he thinks this is a real metaphysical fact about everything. It has really connection to moral goodness, is the ultimate basis of everything. So I think, though, this picture is very similar to an emnationist picture. So the reason I gave this picture of the medieval, this is sort of ancient world picture of the universe, right? And you notice, here's the Earth in the middle. And these are the spheres of the different stars. The sun and the moon, right, down here. And then it goes out and out. And then at the edge, you have the Chelum Imperial, the Empyrean heaven. Now, here's the picture is from a kind of emnationist background. Why? Well, where is God? Well, God is everywhere. But the highest place in this picture is not here. The highest place, the best place to be in this picture is here. Because out here, there's like the good stuff, the closest to God. That's where the angels live in classic medieval theology. They live outside here somewhere. And then being sort of flows down these levels. And the material world that we're down here is the lowest place. So when Satan in Dante's Inferno, where is Satan in this picture? Do you remember? How does Satan, he wants to go to the furthest place away from God in Dante's Divine Comedy, the famous medieval poem about heaven, hell, and purgatory. Where does he go to be the furthest away from God? You know.
Yeah.
Where is he?
The Satan?
Yes.
At bottom of the hell.
Yeah, but where is bottom of hell in this picture?
The center of the earth.
The center of the earth, right? So it's right here because that's the furthest point away from God, right? So I like that picture because it shows you what's going on in the emnationist picture. Okay, so when we think of the metaphysics then, I do think I'm going to just now tell you a little bit in the interest of time. I'm just going to tell you a little bit of what's going on here. Seems to me very clearly similar to Aquinas, right? So if I was Aquinas, I would point out, well, Tianli is what I would be referring to as God. God is pure form for Aquinas and is the principle of the being and nature of everything. Well, guess what? That's a lot like God. In fact, in my book, I point out Aquinas actually uses, I don't know why, but it's really surprising, he uses exactly the same metaphor Zhu Xi does for how God is related to everything else in the universe. He says this, he says, God is the form of all forms. God is like a seal impressed into different qualities of wax. And everything in the universe, from angels to human beings, to cats, to chairs, to rocks, all of them are the same form, a participation in the one form of God in different grades. So that's why I have here this famous Arthur Lovejoy book, The Great Chain of Being, because this emnationist picture is in Aquinas. It's a great chain of being from God down. But that's what we've got here. So if I was to give the equivalent reference in Zhu Xi's philosophy, where's God in the picture? That. It's Tai Chi, Wu Chi, Tianli. That's God. That's doing the same thing as God in Aquinas' metaphysics. And it's very compatible. It is a act, potency, form, matter kind of idea. In fact, I don't have the citation here. I will come back to it. But in fact, Zhu Xi says Li can exist even without Qi. It would not be in any place. It would not have anywhere to settle, he says. It wouldn't be in a space-time location. But he says, even if there were no heaven and earth, there would still be Li. Even if there was no mountain and rivers, there would still be Li. So even if there were no Qi, there would still be Li. In fact, he says Li gives birth to Sheng, Qi. Li, Sheng, Qi, right? Okay, so Li creates or gives birth to Qi. So I think it's very clear that if this thing can exist by itself, this thing is not material, this thing is the source of all being and existence of everything else. This is just like what Aquinas means by a first cause, the big one, the unmoved mover. It has no potential to be any other way than it is. It is existing necessarily. It would exist without anything else. It doesn't depend on anything else. That's this for Zhu Xi. So for his ethics, I've already told you what's important. So I'm going to move beyond this slide. You can read it more about it later. I said, what for Zhu Xi you have to do is to sort of cultivate your ethical nature to sort of return to the source, right? We're down here, like in the Middle Ages picture. We're in the middle of the planets somehow, and we've somehow got to go back, right? He thinks it happens through knowledge and love. You have to learn about this, about Li, and you have to somehow imitate it in yourself. That's the basic idea. He calls it knowledge, investigation of things that leads to knowledge. So the idea then is, at the end, he thinks what's going to happen is if you investigate the world enough, philosophy enough, you will somehow be able to achieve unity with this somehow, complete knowledge. And that's the goal of the moral life, is a kind of knowledge of this. And he thinks that will bring perfect happiness. So I was just going to write one, well, I'll leave it alone. But he says that this kind of, I mentioned last time, there's a sort of classical Confucian ideal, which I'll just put up real quickly, right? Tianren He. So this is how he interprets what that means. Tianren He, in this context, the goal of the moral life for us is to fully become like God, like Tian Li, by letting the nature shine through. And so by investigation of things and moral cultivation, we can become wholly one with heaven in our mind by knowing Li, Tian Li, and by willing it, by having the true connection between our mind and our heart in being intent on heaven. So that's the basic thought. And he thinks that in this picture, the ultimate virtue is Ren-I. So he has a view very much like Aquinas that the supreme principle of being a good person is to be in proper relationship to other people, Ren. And he thinks that this Ren is connected to the emotion I, love of other people. So he thinks that when you are loving other people, you are potentially exemplifying Ren. Ren is the sort of expressed in loving other people, okay? And so this is, without that, he has a unity of the virtues thesis like Aquinas. If you don't have love, you don't have any other virtues. And if you have love, potentially, it seems, you would have all the others. They come together as a package, right? You can't have love without the other virtues. And if you don't have love, you don't have the other virtues. Okay, I have some citations from him, from the Yule, and from a poem of his that I think gives you the idea, right? A small square pond, an uncovered mirror. I ask how it stays so clear. It said spring water keeps flowing in, right? So this idea is that the truly sage person is somebody who is the mirror of our heart is what this is a metaphor for, the mirror of our mind. And it stays pure by being connected to the source. What is the source? Li, right? So by being constantly attentive, cultivating our heart, we let our original nature shine through like a spring welling up from within, because we are already somehow connected at the deepest part of our being to Tian Li, right? We wouldn't exist if we didn't have Li in us. So then this is then the idea, right? This is what I think is interesting. Now, if you want to think about mysticism in Confucianism, he says the nature itself. Remember, nature itself is another one of these. It's a synonym, he says, for these others. Nature, Xing, is Li, is Tian, is Tai Chi. All of them refer to the same thing. That thing in itself cannot be described. We say the nature is good by looking at the goodness of at the emotions that we have, right? The virtues that we have. We can see that the nature is good. This is like when you see the clarity of flowing water. You know that the source of the water must be clear. So he's saying that we know the true nature of human beings is perfected by moral goodness. That makes you more human, to be more good, morally good. So we know the ultimate principle of everything is the source of all that, of all moral goodness. So this must be goodness in itself. Goodness in itself. Guess what? That's Aquinas' argument. Remember from the first lesson, that's Aquinas' reasoning specifically why God is goodness itself. Is because God is the source of everything. Goodness is a pure perfection. It's existence, right, at a higher degree. So we know the source of everything is the source of all those perfections. So it must be complete goodness. That's what Zhu Xi is arguing. That's his reasoning here. He's not exactly arguing, but he's giving reasoning, right, as to why Li is goodness, right? So I think there's quite a lot of overlap here, quite a lot of overlap, okay? This is the ultimate end of moral cultivation, is right after exerting oneself, knowing the world, one will suddenly attain all-encompassing realization of Li, right? So that's the, right, you'll obtain it. That's called knowledge, right? So there's nothing that you won't know, you won't have clearly in mind. So I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit, or I'm going to say a few things now about how their ethics are related. So what are the differences between Zhu Xi and Aquinas? Here's the main difference. I think it's pretty obvious. Grace. Grace, right? I think the Confucian philosophers like Aristotle would not have had any reason to know anything about grace, supernatural possibilities of life. But there are, in fact, some interesting parallels with Aquinas on things that you would not imagine, one of which is original sin. Original sin is a doctrine in Christianity on which there's something wrong with human beings, okay? Now, it is controversial among Christians what is wrong and how to think about what is wrong with human beings. But for Aquinas and the Catholic tradition, we have a particular understanding of original sin. Original sin is this. I'll try to summarize it very quickly. For Aquinas and the Christian tradition of the Catholic version, we think in the Garden of Eden, when God made human beings, he gave them a special gift. They would have not died. They had no sickness or other suffering. But we think we also should say they had no ignorance. They knew all that they needed to know about God and morality from birth. They were in union with God from birth. And most importantly, because of the root of all that is they had a special grace that their mind would totally dominate, be able to control their emotions and their body's desires. So they would never be led astray by things like hunger or being lazy and tired, not to go to the gym or to eat too much. right? So they would never have those problems. And the claim Catholic theology makes is that after original sin, what original sin is we lost that grace. So now, today, people are born in a state where they don't know what God is, except through reasoning. They have to reason about God in philosophy to find God. They don't have much knowledge of morality. They have to be taught by other people what to do, right? They die and get sick, right? And they get led astray by their bodily desires. So all of that is the effect of original sin. So original sin disrupts our relation with God. Everyone is born in that situation. Now, Zhu Xi actually, interestingly, and the Confucian tradition he's part of, give an explanation of moral evil that is very, very similar to this, actually, this picture. They don't talk about any state where our chi would have been perfectly clear or something like that. That's like Adam and Eve in the Catholic picture, where they have the chi is perfectly responsive to your li, to your mind, I should say, in this context. The Neo-Confucians had a hard time explaining our li, our nature, is good. So how are there bad people in the world? Well, they said the badness came from the fact that we have the li is in chi. And the qualities of our chi are what determine the possibilities of moral error and evil in the world. Because our material nature, remember the qi zhi zhi xing, comes in different qualities. Comes in different qualities. They think the sages, people who are naturally more disposed to be moral, are born with better natures. So like a lot of the sages like Hongzi, they think just they were lucky. They were born with a material nature that more easily allowed them to follow the good desires and not be led astray by the bad ones. But they think most people, because that chi we have gives rise to selfish desires and emotions, it's not bad in itself, the chi, but it obstructs our heavenly nature. We can't see the Tian Li because of the chi we have, right? The chi gets in the way, generates bad emotions and that. Overcoming that requires learning and effort, right? So we have from Zhang Zai, who had lived before Zhu Xi, those whose chi is bad can change if they learn. But he says most people are not going to, right? He uses this as an explanation why most people do moral evil. Most people are bad people. Why? Many people are ruled by this bad chi and cannot become worthy people because they don't want to learn. So the problem is something about, here's the other aspect of the Catholic doctrine. Original sin somehow has affected our will, right? That we don't want to do what's good. We don't love the good from when we are born. We don't love God when we are born. We have to sort of get that some later point in time. That's the bane effect of original sin. Well, here's Zhang Zai saying something about the problem with chi is that we don't have that desire, right? We don't have that desire from birth to change, to become good people. We are not ready automatically. Well, this is functionally like the Thomistic understanding of original sin's effects. We call it technically concupiscence, is this core effect. It's a disordered inclination due to the body not being perfectly subject to our mind, to our reasoning. That's what helps generate problems with living a morally good life for people. So Confucians don't have any notion of original sin in the sense of they don't know about Adam and Eve. They don't have that kind of thing going on. They don't talk about a fall. But what they do have, so they don't have any idea also of guilt, right? Because they don't think it's a result of anybody's bad decision. Catholics think people actually did something to do this. So there's some guilt involved in original sin. But the Confucians don't have that. But what they do have is very similar. There's no explicit, I should say, there's also no explicit theory of the will or the way original sin affects the will, but they broadly agree, given our matter not being, our qi zhi xing not being the right quality, it obstructs our mind and keeps us from being good. So this is what leads us morally astray, even though it's true for both Catholics and for Confucians, our nature is good, right? The Catholic claim, the Christian claim is we are made in the image and likeness of God. Human nature is good. Original sin doesn't destroy that. We are still fundamentally good, and we have natural inclinations to virtue, to good behavior. So here's general parallels, right? Moral goodness, like Aquinas, is being more, perfecting your nature. This nature is received from heaven. What counts as flourishing or happiness is not just self-satisfaction. It is actually achieving the good and union with the big good, the G, the capital G good, this, right? Union with the source is happiness, true happiness for Zhu Xi. They have a privation theory of evil. So Zhu Xi could agree with Aquinas. Good and being are convertible. Why? Because evil, moral evil, is unnatural. It is a lack of due order, a lack of manifesting your true nature, the true nature of anything, right? Evil is a privation, a lack of order. The master or controlling virtue is something very like Aquinas' notion of love, caritas, friendship with God. In this context, you have a moral virtue just like that, ren, which is love of other people for the right reasons. The ultimate aim in self-perfection lies outside of yourself, union with heaven, where that principle must be known and loved in virtue of that knowledge. So the goal of the moral life, what it means, Tianren He for him, is, we might even say, a lot like Aquinas' beatific vision. It's not a grace union, but it's a union through knowledge, knowing Tianli and loving it through knowing. That's what gets you perfect happiness. Okay? So that's what I put here. The ideal of enlightenment through knowledge of Tianli fit closely with the beatific vision. And I'll even say one last thing on this, which is maybe there's a Confucian concept of faith. Okay? So faith is usually translated into Chinese as xin, right? Belief. But in this context, I think, in fact, one of the reasons that Aquinas says that we cannot love God without faith is because he thinks the possibility of the beatific vision, we can't know what God is like unless God tells us about the right kind of things for us to trust him. So you can't love what you don't know. So there's a priority of faith to love. You can't love God correctly unless you believe that he exists and that he rewards those who trust him. But there's a remote parallel here in this virtue, cheng, where cheng, making your thoughts sincere, is what the Da Shui says, right? In the Da Shui, one of the Confucian classics, it says you first have to make your thoughts sincere in the right way. But I like this claim. Zhu Xi, in fact, doesn't think you can do that on your own. He interprets cheng, sincerity, as putting your trust in reliable sources, specifically the classics, the Confucian classics. Because he says here, thoughts cannot render themselves sincere on their own. So in fact, you do need faith on the Confucian theory. There's a problem, which is we are broken and we need the sage's wisdom to guide us. So that's why he thinks the classics are important. You need faith in the classics, otherwise you won't be able to be a good person. Well, actually, that's exactly the reason. This is a natural reason, but it's just Aquinas' reasoning why we need faith in God to change our life. We need faith in what he reveals, right, in the scriptures, in the church, in order to rectify our thoughts, right? Because they can't do it on our own, right? Well, Zhu Xi has a natural parallel in the natural realm with philosophy. Okay. So I think there's a lot here that's quite similar. This is from Zhang San. This is his Ximing, the Western inscription. And he has a sort of very general picture of the universe where heaven is my father, earth is my mother. Therefore, that which fills the universe I regard as my body. That which directs the universe I consider as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. So there's a very general notion of love in this Neo-Confucian tradition, universal brotherhood, we might say, with all things, because of this picture, right? Everything is from one principle. Okay, let me just very quickly, I will now briefly, because you don't have as much background on this, but there is a debate. Many people say Zhu Xi and the Confucians don't believe in God. So that's actually a big problem here, because Tian in classical Confucianism, not really God. There's some problem, okay? I'm going to be very quick to give us lots of time for questions. So I will just do 5 minutes on this, because I have done the most important thing, which is to introduce you to the things and the main points of agreement. Now let me just respond to this problem, okay? Why is theism and Confucianism supposed to be incompatible? Well, here's the claim. I will tell you later who said this, but it is repeated very often in Chinese philosophy literature. And the claim is this: the Christian God is transcendent. What they mean is unclear. But what I will say is ontologically separate from the universe and something that is a creator of the universe. Whereas Confucian Tian is immanent. And what that means is, again, unclear, but I will tell you what it means, which is inseparable from the world. It's a part of the world, or the world is a part of Tian. And Tian would not be the same, would not exist if there was no world. That's the claim. And Tian is not a creator. It doesn't create things. Okay. And then there are supposed to be implications. So the implications are Confucianism can't have any idea of these other Christian things, like original sin or grace. Grace is impossible for Confucianism because God is a part of the world. So God, you wouldn't need anything else because God is already a part of you, right? So human nature is capable of self-perfection. Okay. So I think this debate, this allegation is very poor, very bad. Okay. There was, by the way, a new book written on this by a man named Bin Song, who teaches in the US. He just wrote a book on this. He fundamentally agrees with me. So if you want a whole book on this problem, read him. I just wrote an article that is under review. This is sort of a summary of some of that from a previous conference. But my basic position here is I'll just say the people who come up with this, I think, are working from one school of Confucianism. Okay, so there are some people who taught in Hong Kong, the New Confucians. You don't know these people necessarily, but there's Mo Zongsan, Tang Jini, and Du Weiming are famous people who taught in Hong Kong. And they came up with this objection to Christianity. They taught at a Christian school, but they hated Christianity. They were very angry about the Christians. Okay. But the popularizers of this view are more modern. Roger Ames and David Hall wrote some, they're famous interpreters of Confucianism. Roger Ames teaches at Beijing, Peking University, right? But they tried to specify what this is. But I'd say they say some crazy things, in my opinion, things that are contradictory sometimes. So they say God is transcendent because God is independent and he somehow orders, originates, determines, and sustains the universe. But the universe doesn't sustain God. But Tian is somehow sustained by the universe, the material world. And Tian, and then they say this, which I think is really weird. They say Tian is the world. So Confucian God is identical with the world. Okay? That's what they claim. Now, I think this is really problematic. Okay? Here's one problematic reason. I think very easy reason why we should have a problem with this claim. So these people claim all Confucians everywhere believe the same thing about Tian. For all time, all of China, Japan, and Korea, every philosopher in China, Japan, and Korea thought exactly the same thing about Tian that we say. Okay? Now, here's what I think is crazy. Okay? You put 3 philosophers in a room and ask them about something, you get 4 answers, 4 opinions, right? All philosophers from China, Japan, and Korea for 2,000, 4,000 years all believed the same thing. I think this is unbelievable. Just, we don't need to even look at the arguments. I think it is unbelievable, unbelievable, totally nonsense. Just as a matter of logic, of reality, epistemology, right? That's not going to happen, not going to happen. And I think also Confucianism is not a monolith, right? So Confucianism is a school. It's a school of schools. Lots of different views in Confucianism, like Buddhism. Even Buddhism, it's hard to say what all of them believe, right? If you ever studied Buddhism, you'd know. I studied Buddhism. They say there's no self. There's some schools in Buddhism that say there is a self, the Shentong school, right? So there's no pope of Confucianism who says you've got to believe this to be a Confucian. So I think this is crazy, okay? Unbelievable as a thesis already. But I think, in fact, if Tian were strictly identical to the world, I don't think Tian, the documents wouldn't make sense, okay? I'll give you some examples, right? Here are some classics talking about heaven, right? Now let's imagine Tian just is the world. There's no difference. The world is God. God is the world. There's no difference. Strictly numerically identical. Great heaven was moved with indignation and charged my father when to display its terrors. Heaven made them rulers and made them instructors. The world couldn't make you a ruler, right? I mean, I just think this wouldn't make any sense. Be hard to interpret. How could the world be indignant, have anger, right? The world can't be angry, right? Or the crimes committed by the Shang dynasty are outrageous. Heaven commands that the Shang dynasty be punished. Well, the world can't punish anybody. The world can't command anything, right? A pious son serves his parents as if he serves heaven. But if your parents and you are the world, and heaven is you, then you don't need an as if here. You would just say, well, I'm heaven, you're heaven, serving anything is heaven. Serving the chair is serving heaven, right? But that wouldn't make any sense on this view. I think that doesn't just makes a mess of the interpretation. So I'll just say also the goal, Tianren He. If you were already one thing, you and heaven are one thing right now, then this doesn't make any sense, right? Because you can't do it. Because you've done it. You're done. There's no more doing, right? There's no more unity to be overcome. I think also these claims are very misleading because they say, for instance, Tu Wei Ming says, our essence is identical with heaven, so to speak. But of course, the Christians can agree with that, right? As I mentioned with Aquinas, we can say we are made in the image and likeness of God. Our nature is a reflection of God's nature. That's something we can say. So if you add the so to speak, you're denying strict numerical identity, but that's what you need if this critique is going to show us Confucians can't be Christians. You'd have to say they're strict numerical identity, but that's not what he's saying, actually. And then lastly, I think there's a straw man of Christian doctrine here. Particularly, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but for instance, I think that in the classical tradition of Aquinas, he didn't think that you could know from philosophy alone whether the world began to exist in time. He didn't think you needed to prove the universe began to exist in time to prove God existed. He, in fact, gave an account of creation where he said, if the whole world was eternal, never came into existence at time, but it depends on God at all the times it exists, that relation is creation. the world is being created forever. Right? That would be the way we should think about it, if the world didn't begin to exist in time. Aquinas has a treatise on that called De Aeternitate Mundi, on the eternity of the world. Okay? But then you don't need to believe the world began to exist in time to believe that God created the world. Creation doesn't require creation in time to be creation. So, in fact, Aquinas could argue this model could be creation. Even if the world is eternal, eternally emanating from God, if it depends on God immediately, then it's creation. That's it. So, in fact, there's no difference here, right? The Confucians don't believe in creation at a time, but they believe in this. So there's at least some Confucians that, from Aquinas' view, would believe in creation. So there's a problem here. I think there's a lot of other things we could say about this. I will just now qualify. I'm going to say, what is theism? Theism is the belief in the existence of one God, first principle for the being and existence of all other things, essentially distinct from everything, and some add, being personal and exercising providence. I think the only question is, can or should or did Confucians accept this last bit? Whether heaven is personal and exercises providence. I actually think that's the only question that I think there's a big question mark. I think most Confucians held something like this. Not all of them, though. So now let me qualify. Not all Confucians believe this. I'm not going to do what these other bad objectors did. I'm not going to say all Confucians believe the same thing. They didn't. Okay? Some Confucians believed in a thing I think is God. Some did not. Here's an example of someone who did not. Shunzi, right? Shunzi says Tian is just the laws that govern like the seasons. That's what Tian is. But that's not God, right? So I think Shunzi didn't believe in God, right? I'm going to propose, though, there's at least one person who did. There are many people, I think, in the tradition who did believe something like God, okay, in the Confucian tradition. I don't think it was just one or two. I have just some people here in this history. I have a complicated sort of set of history. I'm going to skip all this, okay? But you can come back to it to think about these people. I think this person is really interesting. He's not Confucian, he's a Buddhist, Huifeng Zongmi. He wrote a book arguing against Confucianism during the Tang Dynasty. But I like him. I'm just going to mention him. He argued the Confucians, he said, this is why I'm not a Confucian. I used to be, he says. I rejected Confucianism because the Confucians say there's Tian, and Tian is in charge of everything. And Tian is all good. And Tian generates everything in the world. But I thought, well, there's evil in the world. How could there be Tian if there's evil in the world? And Tian is in charge of everything. Well, if you might know anything about philosophy of religion, this is a famous objection to God's existence called the problem of evil. Huifeng Zongmi makes the same argument against the Confucians. And here's the interesting fact. If you thought Confucians can't believe in God, right, this argument wouldn't make any sense, first, as an argument against Confucians. And you would expect the Confucians in the Tang Dynasty would say, Huifeng Zongmi, you don't understand. We don't believe in God. We think there's just the world, right? So this argument that there's evil in the world wouldn't affect our views. But here's the interesting thing. No Confucian responded to Huifeng Zongmi like that, historically. Nobody responded to him like that. But that's what they should have done if they didn't believe in God. So I think if you're interested in the problem, go read him. One important, interesting witness to this question. Is Tian personal and providential? He seems to think it is, that the Confucians believe Tian is personal and providential. Now I'm just going to briefly say why Zhu Xi is important, okay? Zhu Xi is very clear in thinking that Li, Tian Li, doesn't depend on us. Here's why. He says, Tianli would exist even if there was no heaven and earth. There actually was Li before heaven and earth existed. If somehow all mountains, rivers, and earth itself should vanish, Li would still be here. So we have at least one clear counterexample. The only question for Zhu Xi, as I said, with Confucians in general, is, does God have a mind? Does Tianli have a mind or a will? And I think this is where Zhu Xi is not clear. You can look up some of this, but I'll just focus on this one over here. So Zhu Xi was asked by a student, over here I should say, and then this is the second part of the question. One of his students says, the master instructed me to ponder whether heaven and earth have a mind or not, right? Whether you xin wu xin, right? Jian si zhi, right? Thinking about it closely, I decided heaven and earth don't have a mind. The world has no mind. I secretly believe that they have no mind, okay? They just act like it somehow, right? Benevolence is the heart of heaven and earth. If they were to have a mind, there'd be thought, planning, and action. But heaven and earth have no thought or action. Here's Zhu Xi's response, and I think this is really important. Here's what he says. If heaven and earth have no mind, how do we interpret the I Ching statement, returning reveals the heart of heaven and earth? But as you say, it only accounts for their aspect without mind. If there were no mind in heaven and earth, then a cow would give birth to a horse, and a peach tree would bloom with plum blossoms. Yet it remains fixed and orderly on its own. So he thinks that Tianli is a principle of order in things. And he says things that indicate heaven moves and operates without ceasing. Therefore, there must be a jutsai. Has to have some principle who governs the world. Such matters require one to perceive them personally. They can't be fully conveyed through words. So I think Zhu Xi might have believed heaven is personal, might have believed Tianli had a mind or a will. It wasn't like ours, very clearly, but I think there's something here. So that's where I'm just going to end. I'm going to say the Confucians, I think very reasonably, some of them had a concept of God and a concept of ethics that's very close in many respects to that of Thomas Aquinas. Why is this important? Well, as I said at the beginning, it seems like a big deal if it was true, because it would mean there are people independent of Aquinas who came up with a very similar system for not having read him, right? So you might think it's an indicator to us that there might be something true about this, that the world is this way, that people on the other side of the planet could discover it on their own. Thank you. Now let me turn off the recording and we can have some discussion.